Hello, everyone. Our audience here at 19 University Place in New York and our online audience up in that sky machine over there. I am Bruce Grant. I teach anthropology here at NYU. I am delighted to welcome our guest today. Sam Hodgkin came to us today from New Haven. As you can see up on the screen, I believe, he is an assistant professor of comparative literature at Yale. He began a remarkably full educational program at Harvard, where he did his BA and his MA, and then went on to the University of Chicago to do his PhD. There are some simple things we can say about Sam as a scholar, and there are some extraordinary things, some very warm and ordinary things, but I also really want to emphasize some extraordinary things. The warm and ordinary things is that Sam works on literature in an important world area. He studies medieval and modern Eurasia, and as would only befit someone working in this area, he's looking at literature and cultural history. He's working with prestige languages and vernaculars, classic Persianate poetry, theater, translation, world poetics. All of those are good things and deserving of any scholar worth their salt of comparative literature. And that is one of the reasons we were really delighted to invite Sam to join us today. There's this tricky part, though, which is the extraordinary part, which is that Sam is among a very rare cohort of scholars who has been either naive enough or guileless enough, or I like to think instead fearless enough to look at this part of the world, the Caucasus, Central Asia, the Persianate world, as an ecumene unto itself, which shouldn't necessarily have to be carved up into various area studies traditions. And for people like myself and for some of the people in the room, it's been a discouraging thing since the end of the USSR in 1991 to realize that the world of Slavic studies, though it might have inherited through the Russian Empire and the USSR, the Caucasus and Central Asia, has remained largely indifferent to a serious study of its cultural production. Likewise, the Middle East Studies Association, when my colleagues Setnai Shami and others from now from the Arab Social Science Research Council made forays into the MESA meetings, trying to find ways in which Middle East studies would meet Slavic studies and so forth. The uptake in Middle East studies proper has been quite ginger, certainly respectful, but quite ginger. And while that means that we can all praise and welcome and be grateful for someone like Sam for the work that he's doing today, and praise, as the words I just used, as fearless or worse, guileless as a border crosser, that shouldn't be where we are in the world at the moment. Sam, the Caucasus and Central Asia and the Persianate world, but especially the northern part of the Persianate world, were hardly without literary production for the last 2,500 years, and yet most of academic traditions in every language have ignored it or always cast it at the periphery of other people's worlds. And so as I like to remind Sam, one could praise someone for this, but I also simply want to acknowledge that this is someone who's just an empirical scientist who looks at the world as it is and understands that if we want to take all serious art on its own terms, then that must include, with serious study and with a remarkable repertoire of languages that Sam brings to the table, engagement of this world. So now, of course, having said all of that, the poor guy, has an impossible task ahead of him in front of this group. I will say instead of judging only on the talk today, I really want people to look out for his forthcoming book from Cambridge, which is called Persianate Verse and the Poetics of Eastern Internationalism. Really looking forward to that. Others of you have joined me in seeing his work in Iranian studies and elsewhere. His talk today is up on the screen. Late Persianate, late Soviet, classic poetic form at the end of communist internationalism. So please join me in welcoming our colleague, Sam Hodgkin.
Thanks so much, Bruce. And thank you all for being here or for tuning in. And yeah, in addition to Bruce, a special thank you also to Sasha Spitalnik for inviting me, for arranging this. And another special thanks is due to another NYU faculty member, Rosen Diagolov, who is currently away on leave, but has been a very generous booster of the book that I'll be talking about, speaking from today. His invaluable suggestions as a reviewer helped to make the book what it is. Okay, so that book is about to go out to the publisher with the probable title now, A Poetics of Eastern Internationalism, Persianate Verse, and World Communism. Title wrangling with the publisher has gone down to the wire, so it might change yet one more time. And here you can see the chapter headings. As a whole, the book concerns the intertwined fates of Persianate poetics and world communism from the Russian, Iranian, and Ottoman revolutions of 1905 to 1912 until the Eurasia-wide aftermath of the Soviet collapse. And in it, I show that the inter-imperial communist press was a catalyst for the transformation of Persianate poetics across West, Central, and South Asia. And then to an even greater degree, the modular institutions of Soviet literature became the model for national literary institutions throughout the Persianate zone, from writers' unions to nationally delimited canons of literary classics. And at the same time, I show that the relationship between Soviet Central Eurasian literary bureaucrats and outside of the Soviet Union, West and South Asian leftist anti-colonial writers became the most important hinge for the emergence of the internationalist literary sphere generally, and brought elements of Persianate poetics into the standard representative scheme of post-colonial world literature. The final chapter of the book, from which today's talk comes, considers what happened as the East became less important to the Soviets than the global South. The international Persianate left became less Soviet-aligned, and the Marxist-Leninist model for the representative functions of writers in classic works came under increasing strain. So, and for the Slavists here, I'll just quickly define this word I keep using, Persianate, which is a neologism used by scholars of the Muslim world. It's sometimes used narrowly as a synonym of Persephone to refer to all the cultural production and sociability that's taken place in the prestige language of Persian across the Middle East, Eurasia, and South Asia. But its original broader meaning in the context of 1970s ideas about the longue durée history of civilizations refers to a cultural complex in which cultural forms originating in the Persian language reception of Islam went on to become part of the fabric of vernacular Muslim culture from the Balkans to Western China and from Siberia to Southeast Asia, even among non-Muslims, especially in the Caucasus and South Asia. Either way to define it, until recently, scholars have tended to see the age of European colonialism in these regions in the 18th and especially 19th centuries as the end of the Persianate. More recently, some younger scholars have been showing how important these Persianate forms and even the Persian language were throughout the 20th century in many supposedly post-Persianate regions. And as you might guess from the brief sketch I gave of my book, I certainly think that the category of the Persianate, for all of its problems, is useful for thinking about the 20th century and beyond. But because of that more typical periodization in which the Persianate is long gone by now, scholarship on the modern fate of Persianate culture, much like scholarship on the fate of communist literary internationalism, tends to have an elegiac tone. Books begin with the unbordered world of Persianate cosmopolitanism, or of revolutionary utopian experiment, and end with Persianate cosmopolitanism or world revolution carved up into parochial particularisms. I didn't want my book to have that shape because I don't think that the parts of communist internationalism and Persianate culture that definitively died with the Soviet Union were the parts that we should be celebrating or trying to revive. After all, the saddest years of Persianate internationalism are from the early 30s through the early 50s. The Stalinist transformation of classical Persianate poetic forms and rituals into resources for authoritarian mass politics and the cult of personality, the murder of a whole generation of Persianate scholars and writers in the purges, not just Soviet Eastern writers, also Iranian and other foreign communists. I mean, almost the entire Iranian Communist Party. The destruction of the Comintern, naked Soviet imperialism in northern Iran during and after the Second World War, the defeat of the Iranian left, and the tragedy of Indian partition. And mind you, this is the high watermark of communist and Soviet aligned party membership among intellectuals across West and South Asia, with literary activity throughout the Persianate zone centered on the Soviet-modeled Iranian Writers Union and Indian Progressive Writers Association, and a series of Soviet-led international jubilees celebrating classical Persianate writers. All of this is simultaneous with these terrible things. So after that phase of catastrophic success, it's true that in some respects, Persianate communist internationalism kind of dies, decreasing Communist Party membership and Soviet affiliation in all of those regions, with many writers turning to Maoist or Trotskyist parties, left nationalism or Islamic socialism, the scaling down of direct ties between the national literatures of the Persianate zone, the replacement of all those murdered madrasa-educated leftists by younger generations of writers and scholars educated in state schools whose primary orientation is to Western literary models, who don't read multiple Persianate languages, but do read and write in Russian, French, or English. True, Soviet Central Asian and Transcaucasian literary representatives played leading roles in Soviet Third World cultural diplomacy, especially in the Afro-Asian Writers Association. But as the association's name suggests, the unifying principle was no longer Eastern internationalism, but a global anti-colonialism in which zones of cultural affinity, such as the Persianate, were less important. Nonetheless, as I hope to show you, the crisis of the Soviet model of literary institutionalization and poetics of political representation did make possible the emergence of a looser Persianate radical literary artistic circuit based on a looser logic of mutual recognition. To my mind, it was precisely at this point that the best potentialities of the Persianate International were realized, often beyond the control of the Soviet cultural apparatus or even contrary to its program. In the last two chapters of my book, you will encounter works that offer an escape from the most deadening features of Persianate literary modernity, whether Soviet or Iranian or wherever. Its flattening of the complex classical corpus into a series of mute busts on the shelf, its patriarchal, heterosexist humorlessness, which it bears no relationship to classical Persian literature, and its shrunken formal repertory. As the Sufis say, die before you die, meaning kill your sense of yourself as this reified entity in order to achieve sublimity. And Persianate poetics underwent precisely this kind of process, both inside and outside the Soviet Union, from an increasingly reified set of national and international canons and roles for writers, from a cliched repertory of local color and heritage discourse, there emerged a newly vital, direct artistic engagement with classical Persianate texts and forms that was playful, queer, and genuinely receptive to the strangeness of the poetic past. And crucially, this receptivity drew extensively on Soviet models and ideas. So rather than ending with melancholy loss, my book has an arc of redemption. This is all very abstract. So first, let me give you a concrete example of what it means to look around the late communist world and see late Persianate culture holding it together, but in a grim, unsustainable way. So the first time we're going to see the sort of grim version of it. So this particular vision of late Soviet, late Persianate culture comes from the public culture of Soviet-occupied Afghanistan. And just to review the basic history, in April 1978, the Saud Revolution, really a military coup, brings the radical Khalq faction of the Afghan Communist Party to power, and they imprison leaders of the more moderate Parcham faction of the party. Imprisoned Parchami Afghan communists and major Soviet Tajik poets who know each other through the literary conference circuit, write each other epistolary poems of commiseration and solidarity. And then in December 1979, the Red Army invades to replace the Khalqis with the Parchamis. One of these Parchami prison poets immediately becomes the Minister for Radio and Television and the President of the Academy of Sciences. And the Soviet state begins planning what they believe will be a short counterinsurgency against uprising in the provinces, relying heavily on Soviet Central Asian troops, translators, and cultural diplomats. So here, 3 years into the resulting military quagmire, we have an Uzbek language ghazal by the poet Muhammad Amin Ankhui, pen name Mateen, published in the Afghan magazine Juandun. And Juandun is an older general interest magazine. In the 60s and 70s, it was like the Afghan Life magazine, basically. But this is from the first issue after it became the organ of the state-aligned Afghan Writers' Union. And Mateen belonged to the ethnic Uzbek minority of Afghanistan. And after the Writers' Union took over, Juandun, which had been only printed in Dari Persian, started publishing in Pashto as well. And the verse that it included had selections in Afghan minority languages like Uzbek. The poem thematizes the Soviet-Afghan friendship with the refrain, "Ikkimiz," the two of us, which unites the Afghan Civil Revolution of 1978 with its inspiration, the October Revolution of 1917. So here's the last few couplets, and I'll read it in Uzbek, and you can see it up on the screen in English. İki iki köngülden bir hadaf çekmiş navo. Bir tan içra maskin olan sevgili can ikimiz. İki tilden bir baradarlık sarısı kelgusu. Dostluk gulzarda maşhur davran ikimiz. Berdi ilham inkılabı savrımız gahi oktober. El uluski yangi davranlarını tuzgan ikimiz. Armağan elatin Matin'den ushbu mavzun nomanı iki yor iki aynaradik kadrdon ikimiz. And the one linguistic feature of this that I want to draw to your attention, that first line of the quoted passage, two hearts, the first time, hearts is the Persian word dil, and the second two hearts from which they get that song are kungul, which is the Turkic word, or the Uzbek word. So there's a transfer from Uzbek to Persian here. Yeah. Many ghazals have a refrain repeated after the rhyme at the end of each couplet. And this one makes the couplet itself a formal counterpart to the Soviet-Afghan friendship through this refrain, "Ikkimiz." A lot of verse from Soviet Central Asia, including Uzbekistan, talks about two Easts, the liberated Soviet East and the enslaved neo-colonial foreign East. But in this poem, the two Easts become one. Other dichotomies have been unified. The Persian Dari and Uzbek words for heart dwell in one body in a couplet celebrating the Afghan multinational rose garden of friendship that speaks in two languages. So now these two languages at this point now would be Persian and Pashto, which if Afghanistan is a multinational state on the Soviet model, are the primary nationalities. And the division between Soviet Cyrillic script, Uzbek, and the poem's Arabic script, Afghan Uzbek, I should say, as an aside, remains an unspoken, unresolved duality. And actually, Aynagha, the word for brother in the title of the poem, is a dialect word that is not part of standard Uzbekistan Uzbek. But anyway, the resolution or attempted resolution of oppositions reaches its kind of claustrophobic endpoint in the final refrain. So typically, both erotic and mystical ghazals dwell in the pain of separation from the beloved or from God. And plenty of earlier communist poets in Persianate traditions deployed this topos to thematize the pain of being held apart by national borders. And perhaps the most famous and beautiful are the ghazals that the Urdu poet Faiz Ahmed Faiz produced after the Indian partition. But Mateen reproduces a Soviet Eastern multinational anti-poetics of union and resolution. So the Persianate lover-beloved pairing, the two dear ones, and the brotherhood, the two brothers of communist slogans, are likewise equated with each other, as all oppositions are reduced to mirrored pairs that affirm each other's identical value. And it's telling that another issue of Juandun from the same year has as its cover Gorky circa 1934 in a Central Asian skull cap and robe, an image that sort of brings us back to the insulting and petrified national repertories and ethnic drag performances of Stalin-era multinational culture. Okay, so the Soviet Union obviously didn't invade Afghanistan in 1979 because of the shared culture between the Tajiks, Uzbeks, Pamiris, and other ethnic groups on both sides of the border. The geopolitics of the Soviet state impelled imperialist military interventions and invasions all over the world because as a state, the Soviet Union was an imperialist power whose behaviors often differed little from any other modern Western empire. But for the numerous Central Asians, both Soviet and Afghan, who fought, worked, died in the effort to transform Afghanistan into a communist country, internationalist solidarity was not a cynical fiction or a self-deluding rationalization, as it clearly was for the policymakers in the Kremlin then as now. It was a commitment, and indeed it was a tradition. In Afghanistan, the articulation of internationalist feelings took place in an idiom and in genres that had taken shape during the Soviet invasions of Iran from 1920 to 21 and from 1942 to 46, in the Indo-Soviet friendship, among the numerous Turkish, Iranian, and South Asian communists who'd come to the Soviet Union as students, exiles, or diplomats, and most of all, in the multinational public culture of the Soviet East. Through the late Soviet period, the Afro-Asian Writers' Congresses and literary jubilees in honor of classical Persianate poets provide occasions for some really vital poetry and art, but also a lot of cultural production along the lines that I've just sketched. So that's one vision of late Soviet, late Persianate, but it isn't the only possibility. With the time that remains, let me tell you another story belonging to the more informal circuit of mutual recognitions that I mentioned earlier. A story about Parajanov in Iran. Not that the major Soviet Armenian filmmaker Sergei Parajanov ever made it to Iran. He tried after his first prison sentence for matters related to his homosexuality. Upon release in January 1978, on the eve of the Iranian Revolution, he evidently wrote an unsuccessful petition to Brezhnev requesting permission to emigrate to Iran, although it's unclear how serious this gesture was. Again, in the mid-80s, out of prison and resurrected as the state-sponsored darling of Georgian perestroika cinema, he made attempts to get permission to shoot his Azerbaijani language film Ashaq Qarib in Iran, but failed. So Parajanov, the person, never got across the Aras River to Iran, but he produced a series of films listed here, both before and after the period of his persecution, that reflect on the memory of Persian imperium in the South Caucasus and that engage with Persianate form, including literary form, in profound ways that I'll discuss in a bit. To start with, though, it's the reception of Parajanov's Persianate films that I want to tell you about. In the early 80s, shortly before his artistic rehabilitation in the Soviet Union, Parajanov became a canonic official model for state film in the Islamic Republic. And I think the Iranian reception of Parajanov during and after the last years of the Soviet project can really help us to see the formal project of Parajanov's Persianate films afresh. So here's how it happened. During Mohammad Khatami's tenure as the Minister of Culture and Islamic Guidance from 1982 to 92, this is long before he became the head of government, his two leading appointees in the film sector, Fakhruddin Anvar and Sayyid Mohammad Beheshti, promulgated as a state-approved style what came to be known as the mystical or Gnostic film, filme ma'nogira or filme erfani. And this was to be the art cinema of the Islamic Republic, full of impressionistic intimations of the divine. And Parajanov and Tarkovsky were upheld as exemplars. Here you can see some results alongside the source images from Parajanov. And I can talk more about this if you want. There's a lot to be said. But both directors, both Tarkovsky and Parajanov's poeticity and Christian mysticism provided a template. And Parajanov's use of Persianate symbols, soundscapes, and material culture made him especially useful. An Iranian film critic later recalled, quote, "I remember a film called Parajanov called The Color of Pomegranates was shown in cinemas and was highly publicized here. Then, copying that film, a lot of Iranian filmmakers had somebody holding a pomegranate in their hand in a scene that was supposed to make their film mystical," end quote. Iranian art films of the late 80s and early 90s, both state-approved and repressed, are full of evocations of pomegranates and to a lesser degree Parajanov's other films, although the trend died down after Anvar and Beheshti left office. But just when Parajanov was fully out of fashion, in 1995, the Iranian filmmaker Mohsen Makhmalbaf, already by then one of the most important Iranian filmmakers of the post-New Wave generation, embarked on a 10-year phase of close engagement with Parajanov's films. Makhmalbaf had started out as an Islamist militant in the run-up to the Islamic Revolution, and his early films were sort of agitprop sponsored by the Ministry of Culture and Islamic Guidance. And Slavist, you might think of him as sort of the Medvedkin of Iranian cinema, a real organic intellectual of the revolution. By the early 90s, though, his relationship with the Islamic Republic's cultural apparatus was strained, and his films, like Parajanov's decades earlier, were receiving little to no release at home, but garnering awards on the global film festival circuit. These films are formally and thematically very diverse, attempting everything from gritty urban realism to witty pastiche of silent film. And then, with his 1996 folkloric film Gabbe, he begins what I'm calling his Parajanov period. Except for Gabbe, this mostly coincided with the reformist administration of Mohammad Khatami, now as prime minister, from 1997 to 2005, when Makhmalbaf enjoyed a brief return to official approval, much like Parajanov in the years of Glasnost and Perestroika. But his degree of integration into the state culture system remained limited, and he produced many of his films from this period in other countries of the Persianate zone, from Tajikistan and India to Georgia. Makhmalbaf's Parajanovian films evade narrativity and slide into sublime visual and auditory beauty, even when their subject is the Taliban occupation of Afghanistan, as in Kandahar, or a series of tawdry love affairs, as in Sex and Philosophy. In this period, Makhmalbaf produced a sustained investigation of Parajanov's cinematic language, especially in the films that he made in the Persianate near abroad, and in the case of Gabbe, an Iranian ethnic minority region. This investigation's most successful product is The Silence, Sukut, which engages directly with the classical Persianate poetic tradition. And it concludes more or less with Sex and Philosophy, Sexy Philosophia, an extremely mannered exploration of Parajanovian formal grammar, from which Parajanov's themes and indeed his spirit are almost entirely absent. His next film, Scream of the Ants, marks his final departure into exile from Iran, with a film full of blasphemy and nudity, unpresentable to the censors in a way that his previous films had never been. This film also marks his farewell to Parajanov. It still has one eye on the trans-regional Persianate ethnography and mysticism that recurs in his films of the previous decade, and it has some extremely Parajanovian moments. But as a whole, it prefigures both the style and concerns of subsequent films of spiritual searching, like The Gardener, which he made in 2012 at the Baha'i World Center in Israel. I should say that this is my periodization. I've never seen Makhmalbaf or anyone else identify this as a single phase, or connect any of his films but Gabbe and the silence with Parajanov. It is more usual to bring together Gabet, the silence, and the gardener as his poetic trilogy. And this grouping, even if it originates with the director himself, reflects a somewhat vague notion of poeticity and poetic cinema, the kind of vague poeticity we find in the mystical films of the other Iranian directors favored by the culture ministry in the 80s and early 90s. Whereas in both Parajanov's Persianate films and Makhmalbaf's Parajanovian films, we may find poeticity in a more precise sense, replicating not only the thematics of Persianate lyric verse, but also its formal structures to a degree unmatched elsewhere. So this process begins with his 1996 film Gabet, and the name refers to a kind of carpet in which the directness of his reference is most striking. Here you can see a shot-for-shot quote in which Parajanov's scene from the poet Sayatchnova's childhood among wool dyers with 3 dyeing vats and 3 platters for dyed wool is repeated in the nomadic tribal carpet weaving that Makhmalbaf stages in Gabet. In subsequent films, Makhmalbaf's experimentation with Parajanov's cinematic language becomes more programmatic as he works it out at the level of grammar rather than in particular images. Still, Gabet is a good place to start, both because its quotations of Parajanov are more direct and because it drew an oft-cited remark on the relationship between these two filmmakers. So in the course of a brilliant discussion of Parajanov's visual language, the Armenian ethnographer Levon Abrahamyan, an acquaintance of Parajanov who acted in The Color of Pomegranates, makes an offhand and ambivalent reference to Gabet. Quote, if Makhmalbaf is quoting Parajanov consciously, Abrahamyan writes, then the absence of any direct reference to the original appears baffling. End quote. Especially since Parajanov's films are so little known that American reviews of Gabet made no reference to them, despite their basic importance for understanding what Makhmalbaf is doing. For this reason, he writes, the traditional Eastern method of constructing a text as a mosaic of quotations and poetic echoes here resonates almost like a kind of plagiarism that leaves an unpleasant aftertaste. Well, we in this room know, that the charge of plagiarism, which has since been repeated in English language studies of Parajanov, is just a matter of unawareness of how ubiquitous that director was in Iran, such that no educated Iranian filmmaker in 1996 could have missed the reference. But quotation and mosaic do capture something about both directors' formal method. So in order to think about the relationship between late or post-Soviet and late or post-Persianate in a positive, productive sense, the geographical affinity between these two filmmakers is not a bad place to start. Between them, the two directors map out a cultural continuum covering much of the zone where Persian was an important prestige language and trade language, and where Persian canonic texts and cultural forms originating in Persian played a central role in the formation of regional and local literary vernaculars, Anatolia, Transcaucasia, Central and South Asia. I don't mean to suggest that Parajanov and Makhmalbaf's works merely reflect an essential Persianate cultural unity. Rather, they both reflect on and construct such a unity from within a shared ideological framework. Parajanov's films are never so much national works for their respective Soviet national republics, right? Suram Fortress is his Georgian film, Ashok Karib is his Azerbaijani film, and so on. But they aren't so much national as they are celebrations of a cultural unity among the peoples of Transcaucasia, a unity that connects to an Iranian world beyond. In Legend of Suram Fortress, the main characters move back and forth across the confessional line between Christian and Muslim. And Ashok Karib, the titular Turkic Muslim minstrel hero, is victimized for traveling in foreign lands and takes shelter in a ruined church. And Parajanov added this sequence with this caption, "There is one God," after the beginning of Azeri-Armenian violence in Karabakh. So the subject of The Color of Pomegranates, the real 18th century Armenian minstrel Sayatchnova, wrote verse in Armenian, Georgian, and Turkic, in fact, most of it in Turkic. And we encounter verse in all three languages in that film. Most famously, the film opens with three pomegranates for the three peoples of Transcaucasia dissolving into a single sea of juice. And this is usually read reasonably as an evocation of bloodshed, but it might also evoke union. Again, die before you die. Just thinking about this in this moment in the Caucasus, it's painful, but maybe some kind of reason to hope for something. As the preeminent English language Parajanov scholar James Steffen points out, there is nothing politically subversive about any of this, neither its idealization of national cultures, nor its celebration of their long-standing deep entanglement into a single cultural unity. Sayat Nova was deployed in Soviet state culture precisely as an emblem of the prehistory of the Soviet friendship of peoples, back projecting the communist internationalist spirit of solidarity into the long history of the region. Soviet Eastern writers, artists, and cultural bureaucrats frequently pointed to the multilingual poetic culture of the medieval and early modern Persianate zone in their appeals to South Asia, Afghanistan, Iran, and Turkey. Now, Iran has a somewhat complicated presence in Parajanov's films, especially Color of Pomegranates and Ashik Qarib, both of which have tyrannical Iranian conquerors on the horizon. In Pomegranates, the real founding Qajar ruler, Agha Muhammad Khan, whose invasion of Transcaucasia probably resulted in Sayat Nova's death, is an element, a plot element. And in Ashik Qarib, the two folkloric tyrants are both kind of vaguely Iranian. And one of them, Nader Pasha, has a name suggesting the 18th century conqueror Nader Shah. And here you can see them both presented in a style of high Orientalist camp, perhaps with the frisson of the Islamic Revolution in the background. Notice that the wives of the Pasha are shooting off Kalashnikovs in the audience chamber. So to the left in Pomegranates, near the end of the film, the Qajar horde's Mongol-looking horseman shoots down the Virgin Mary from a church mosaic. Persian rulers bring tyranny, interconfessional strife, and civilizational ruin to the Caucasus in these films. But in Parajanov's own accounting, Persian cultural forms also provide the central generative force of the film, as they did for the verse of Sayat Nova, an indubitably Persianate poet. Parajanov described the film as, quote, a Persian jewelry case. On the outside, its beauty fills the eyes. You see the fine miniatures. Then you open it, and inside you see still more Persian accessories. In fact, he recalled preparing for the film with extensive visits to the Qajar painting collections of Tbilisi, and he inserted several racy examples into the film itself, as well as staging numerous tableaux vivants in the gestural style of Persian manuscript painting. Both of these practices he repeated in Ashik Qarib and to a lesser degree in Suram Fortress. And as we've seen, he also yearned to go to Iran. But by the time Mahmoud Baf made his own border crossings to find freedom in the Persianate near abroad, the Soviet Union had collapsed and Parajanov had died. Mahmoud Baf's Parajanovian films likewise emphasize the cultural diversity of the places where they're filmed. Silence, for example, is set in Tajikistan, but a nomadic Turkmen musical group play an important role in the film. And all of these films are multilingual and multi-dialectal. Communism, meanwhile, makes only 2 appearances in the final 2 films of the sequence from 2005. There's a shot full of Lenin memorabilia in Sex and Philosophy, and a demonstration by Indian communists that the Iranian husband and wife protagonists pass by in Scream of the Ants, which serves only to remind the ex-communist husband of his lost political illusions. But this absence or erasure reveals something important about the fate of Soviet Eastern internationalism. If we start from the insight of scholars like Ron Sunni and Terry Martin that Soviet nationalities policy constructed and reinforced national identities and cultural institutions that proved more durable than most Soviet institutions, well, In Parajanov and Makhmalbaf, and indeed in other cases in my book, we find an addendum to this insight. Eastern anti-colonial internationalism, and more specifically, the idea of the ages-old unity of the Persianate East, was likewise an idea whose potency was less dependent on its specifically socialist coloration than Soviet cultural planners had believed. Makhmalbaf's conception of an Eastern cultural commons, like many post-1989 essentialist visions of the unity of the Persianate zone, was structured by conventions inherited from Soviet Eastern internationalism, even if that source and its ideological orientation had been forgotten or erased. But these two filmmakers are linked by something more fundamental than a shared identitarian geography. That shared geography explains why the method and language of filmmaking that Parajanov had discovered in the lyric poetry of Sayat-Nova was so immediately comprehensible and useful for Makhmalbaf, but it's that method, that language, that is the fundamental Persianate artistic legacy here. As I asserted before, The Color of Pomegranates was suppressed not for its political content, but for its form, which bureaucrats and critics regarded as too obscure for what was supposed to be a biopic. Beginning in the late Stalin years, Soviet biopics of great Eastern poets were heroic life stories in which the actual works of the poets played little or no role, and often there was actually made up verse by the poets, as I've found in the course of doing this research. In Pomegranates, by contrast, there is so little explicitly conveyed of the poet's life that when the censored and recut film was released, it bore a disclaimer that it was not a biography of Sayat-Nova, but an attempt to convey the world of images of his poetry. What does this mean in practice? Well, we don't see Sayat-Nova's possibly mythical death at the hands of the Qajar hordes, but we see many figurations of this death in the film's tableaux vivants. We hear a Sayat-Nova song in which the singer declares himself a man of sorrows as the poet slowly covers his face while uncovering a skull in a Qajar era helmet. And elsewhere in the film, in a graveyard, the poet receives a flatbread filled with soil from an angel, which he eats. And still elsewhere, wine is poured down the front of his white robe as a stand-in for bloodshed. These are all conventional Persianate images for death, or more figurative annihilation of the self, some of them also biblical. And furthermore, as the first image should remind us, the poet's death at the hands of a cruel Turk soldier is itself perfectly conventional as a trope of Persianate love poetry, referring to the indifferent young male beloved, beautiful and white, like the conventional image of a Turk, and therefore, as a Turk, a cruel warrior. There's more to this chain of associations because the patron was also often a Turk warrior ruler. But as the movie reminds us, the biography that was later made out of Sayat-Nova's little documented life was itself a product of Persianate lyric convention. So it's just as well to animate the poetry rather than reproduce a cliche narrative of heroic genius. I mean, it gets us as close to Sayat-Nova, closer really. The early advocates and detractors of Parajanov's films, beginning with The Color of Pomegranates, as well as the director himself, all tended to situate the phase's dominant visual style as a kind of image writing. When Moscow censors first reviewed the film, they expressed concern about the excessive hieroglyphic and encoded qualities of his pictorial system. That's a quote. And the hieroglyph is an apt descriptor for the film's precisely linguistic organization of individual conventional images into rebuses, corresponding to poetic conceits. At the center is the film's most important double sign, the actress Sofiko Chiorelli, who plays Sayat-Nova as a youth, and the princess whom he supposedly loved, according to the story, as well as other symbolic roles in the story. And this is a perfect encapsulation of the queerness and self-referentiality of classical Persianate love poetry, Sayat-Nova's included. I want to stress that just as this rebus quality is not the only distinctive feature of Parajanov's style, his symbolic elements are not all Persianate in origin, nor all from Sayat-Nova's verse. There are also many Christian, folkloric ritual, and idiosyncratically Parajanovian symbolic elements. But in addition to symbols, From the Persianate poetic idiom, Parajanov also borrows this approach of piling up conceits by a process of association to form complex mixed metaphors. Levon Abrahamian, whom I quoted earlier, really gets at this feature of the color of pomegranates in his essay, as only a critic who's actually read Sayat Nova's poetry can. Having labored my way through it with my not very good Armenian, I can say this. Because the pileups of images are often specifically from particular Sayat Nova stanzas. I can tell you about this in the Q&A if you want. But in this sense, the mosaic quality of intertextuality that Abrahamian finds in Mahmoud Abbas's reworking of Parajanov's film, what he calls the tradition of imitation, and Persianate poets would have called nazireh or istiqbal, is a method that Mahmoud Abbas takes not from some deep well of his own Easternness as an Iranian, but from Parajanov, who perfected that method in his Persianate late films as no previous filmmaker ever had, whether in Iran, the Soviet Union, or anywhere else. And I should add that Parajanov himself was barely literate in Armenian, never mind in Georgian or Azeri, and relied on Russian translations to read Sayat Nova's verse while preparing his screenplay. Parajanov's distance from Sayat Nova, which was greater than the distance of any Iranian filmmaker from classical Persian verse, is an indicator of the destruction of the old translingual, transregional Persianate culture. And Parajanov relies on Qajar paintings in part because by his time, Persianate genres no longer feel fundamental to contemporary Armenian literature and culture. But what's astonishing then is that this highly mediated encounter generated the most successful filmic rendering of the rhetorical structures of Persianate poetry. So it should be apparent now why I say that these films are poetic in a more precise sense than is usually meant when critics talk about poetic cinema, a category which, as my dear departed mentor, Robert Byrd remarks, quote, continues to enjoy wide currency despite its inherent vagueness. In French and Russian criticism, the designation is associated first and foremost with a subordination of plot to the symbolic, the rhythmic, and the sensuous. This identification owes a lot to the post-romantic European conflation of poetry with lyric, but in fact, it requires no special relationship with the verbal art of poetry, just an analogy to poetry. Poetic cinema is to narrative cinema as poetry is to prose. Even where they quoted Parajanov, the Iranian mystical films of the 80s and early 90s were poetic only in this looser sense. And this is no surprise. Like most Soviet and Western viewers of Parajanov, Iranian viewers regarded as mysteriously poetic many collections of images in the color of pomegranates that are simply referential, because they hadn't read the Sayat Nova lyrics in which these same images are assembled in a more legibly rhetorical way. I mean, truly, like there's so much that people think is so mysterious in the color of pomegranates that isn't mysterious at all if you read the poetry. And just to be clear, Parajanov's subsequent films don't have equivalent poetic corpuses to draw on, but they extend a vocabulary of images originating in pomegranates with an ever more intent focus on the Persianate elements of that idiom and an ever more outrageous Persianate queerness. As I say, I won't deal directly with Parajanov's adaptations of specific Sayat Nova poems today, but I will show what happens when Mahmoud Abbas applies those same techniques to the filmic adaptation of classical Persian verse. So Gabeh is the Mahmoud Abbas film that makes the most direct allusions to Parajanov's films, and the one that most closely follows the earlier filmmaker's formalist visual language is Sex and Philosophy. But we get the richest version of this operation in Mahmoud Abbas's 1998 Tajik film, The Silence, Sukut. The protagonist of this film, a blind boy named Khurshid, played, of course, by a girl with visible ear piercings, walks with his mother down rows of women at the bazaar, repeating near identical pitches for their near identical pomegranates and flatbreads, which they hold up beside their heads to form these perfect Parajanovian two-dimensional friezes. And the boy touches the loaves to evaluate them as he passes. An equivalence is already set up between faces and voices and fruits or loaves. Khurshid stops to buy bread from a girl whose voice he says is pretty. And as he walks away, he acknowledges, "Nonush sachte, lekin ovozash narzai." Her bread is hard, but her voice is nice. To the visual equivalents set up by the pan down the line of faces and lobes, this remark provides a punchline as tidy and clever as the second half of a couplet in a Persian ghazal. But as in The Color of Pomegranates, the poetic rebuses in the silence are grounded in direct encounters with specific classical texts. In two different sequences where Khurshid gets lost while chasing after appealing songs, the songs are Rumi ghazals about the mystical state of bewilderment. And the most involved game along these lines takes place on a bus, where Khurshid is tempted into unblocking his ears to listen to two schoolgirls trying to memorize a quatrain attributed to the medieval mathematician Omar Khayyam. Az di ki guzasht, hech azu yod makun. Fardo ki naomade ast, faryod makun. Far naomade guzashta bunyod makun. Hol khush bash, umr barbad makun. Don't think about yesterday, it's gone. Don't cry about tomorrow, it's not here yet. Don't build on the foundation of what hasn't come or what's past. Be cheerful, don't throw your life to the wind. Now, in this case, we don't get a rebus. Unlike other scenes in this film, this one doesn't look Parjanovian, flat and full of visual symbols arranged in a tableau. Instead, Makhmalbaf transposes the Persian poetic form onto the level of dialogue. The girls are having trouble memorizing the quatrain, getting giggly, and the unsubtitled speech you'll hear is them reciting this quatrain over and over, when Khurshid interrupts with a perfect recitation of it. Then he explains how he did it. Okay, so let's watch that clip real fast.
چشماتو نپوچین امروی من تکرار کنم از دی که گذشت هیچ از او یاد نکن فردا که نآمده است فریاد نکن برگ نآمده گذشتیم بنیاد نکن خالی خوش باش اون برباد نکن اینو از مکتب گذاشتیم بین نیست مکتب ایستا بین ما از مکتب گذاشتیم ایستا
Okay, so this genuinely funny episode is not structured by a rhythmic presentation of rhyming images, as in Parajanov's lyric adaptations, but by the rhythm and rhymes of dialogue. Still, it transposes Persian poetic form to film as successfully as Parajanov and Pomegranates. In this case, the four-part structure of the rubai, A, rhyme structure, turns into four narrative beats. And you can see how the first, second, and fourth beats involve a recitation of this rubai. This implotment of the rubai structure appropriately concludes with the payoff of meaning. In interviews, Makhmalbaf has consistently insisted that he has no interest in classical poetry or mysticism as such, declaring, "I see poetry more in everyday life than in old divans by dead poets." Maybe this is the precondition for the vital encounters with that tradition that he stages. At the moment of the missed bus stop, the Persianate tradition offers a path through the pangs of losing the communist future. In closing their eyes, the girls leave behind the stadial development time of education and public transport, both of which were in crisis when the scene was filmed shortly after the UN armistice technically ended the Tajik civil war, though in a way it goes on. To keep time, they rely instead on the metronome of poetic meter, which will not help them to get off at the right stop or get to school on time, but which grounds them, however briefly, in the moment and also in the longue durée of human history. To be post-Soviet, they have to dwell with the post-Persianate. So I hope you can see why I feel a little hopeful about the vitality of these forms in this tradition. The Eastern internationalists kept classical forms and voices alive, but they used the forms to consecrate state sovereignty, as in Matin's poem, and petrified the poets into statues. Parajanov and Makhmalbaf and many of their contemporaries in various ways found modern forms that give immediacy back to the poetry itself. We get not the masculine author, which had always been a post-romantic Western construction, but instead the ambiguously gendered personae and addressees that populate the work when they're allowed to speak for themselves. This isn't a high elite Persianate culture, but a demotic, macaronic tradition spread across many languages and dialects. The resources for this shift were contained in the official Soviet and international communist presentation of Persianate culture in its most egalitarian moods, but it took people outside of that representational system. And it will take more generations of artists and scholars to work out the full possibilities contained within this transformed tradition. Thank you.
We have an easy group. We have a few people on the screen, so we have, if anyone would like to pose questions, I have a few notes. But let's start with Natalia Loss in the room, please.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm Natalia Loss, a postdoctoral fellow here at the Jordan Center. And I was absolutely amazed by your talk and by your story of Parajanov. It's like absolutely something new for me. I didn't know about this, but so I have two questions in this regard. So first, it concerns Parajanov himself and like his kind of cultural legacy. So I know Parajanov as a cult Ukrainian filmmaker. I'm from Ukraine, right? So, and it's like he started with Ukraine and this like the very famous film, you know, The Shadows of Forgotten Ancestors, and this film. But my question is that like what I know about him and about that film in particular, that it was actually like a celebration of Ukrainian nationalism and national cultures that was, so to speak, alternative to kind of Soviet culture, or at least those parts of Ukrainian cultures that the Soviet Union had trouble to incorporate as like proper like Soviet Ukrainian kind of cultural legacy. So I'm curious about, so what you presented about him kind of differs so much from my vision and like understanding of his legacy. So I'm curious if you can comment a little bit from what I see as Parajanov as a filmmaker who celebrates nationalism to what you presented as what you say kind of international kind of culture with, or like Eastern internationalism. So do you see, is it kind of something that was, you know, like an evolution of his own kind of understanding and contribution? Like, was it how like we differently kind of see his legacy and interpret it according to our own needs? I don't know, it's kind of, but I'm curious like what you kind of might think about like this, what I see as like great discrepancies and you know, the two images of him. And my second question is a little bit more, like if you comment a little bit more about that concept that you're using, this Eastern internationalism. And I think like you kind of showed really well all of this kind of like Persian components of it, but I wasn't a bit like unsure like what you mean when you include like Soviet or communist kind of part in this definition, or if there's like anything like is like the Soviet Eastern internationalism, or is it like Persian Eastern internationalism, and is it like something different, or is it like some kind of coincidence there? Because again, like what you showed is really shows again like national cultures and some like national entanglement in those films. But I'm kind of like I'm kind of having trouble to understand what's particularly Soviet here, or what's particularly kind of communist here. Yes, thank you.
So on the first question, I do think that there, like, your question gets at something here, which is, you know, Parajanov is just so full of like stjob and, you know, like contrariness that of course in Ukraine he it aligns in some ways at least with the nationalists. You know, not all Ukrainian nationalists came away from encounters with him during and after the making of that film feeling good about his relationship to their project. So you know that should be kept in mind. But you know, when as a Tiflis Armenian, you know, mostly Russophone Armenian, he goes back home, right? He's of course going to have like a more standoffish relationship with the national project, and I think that like you know, that film is deeply beloved by many Armenian nationalists, you know, many diasporic Armenians, but it really didn't do what a lot of people would have wanted a film like the film about Sayat Nova to do. And that was partly out of like, in a way, trueness to the source material, which is astounding, again, given his distance from the source material, his limited access to it, only through translation. I mean, that's sort of the short answer to that from my perspective. There's more to be said, but now, so I gave you like the tail end of this project, which is why it's a little like confusing to talk about the role of the Soviet Union as a hub for the emergence of this this circuit of connections and fellow feeling across, you know, across borders that ended up not needing the Soviet Union at all in the end. But like, my story really begins with the role of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, the like precursor party to the Bolsheviks, in like making the parties of constitutionalism in Iran, you know, really producing like across borders, you know, some of the literary forms of, you know, radical new verse in newspaper poetry, and so in the 1920s, you know, you end up with Moscow and Tashkent as hubs for, you know, revolutionaries from all over the, you know, anti-colonial movements of, well, what they themselves thought of as the East. That this was sort of the going geopolitical term, both among, you know, anti-colonial activists in, you know, late Ottoman, you know, early Turkish Republic in Iran and in South Asia. And for the Bolsheviks, this was the operative geopolitical term. So you end up with this like coalescence of an idea of Eastern internationalism, like the East as a sphere of revolution that happens very much through a combination of official Soviet policy and, you know, the initiative and, you know, often like not exactly what the Soviets would have wanted, initiative of both Soviet Eastern, you know, activists and writers from those other countries who came to the Soviet Union. You know, so that's the context in which the Soviet Union really is like the missing piece of the puzzle for people who, in sort of Iranian studies and Persianate studies, who've been kind of trying to like, you know, understand this picture and really like, you really can't understand this picture without understanding the Soviet Union at the center of it in the first half of the 20th century anyway. Yeah, so.
I'm glad to follow with a question there, but I'll also just remind again, at least by speaking loudly for the people on the screen, that that we have at least 3 friends on the screen who can also pose questions in the chat or just raise their hands to ask a question too. Hey there. Sorry, I don't need to be on camera. Here I'm hiding behind a potted palm. I like to follow on Natalia's question though, because among, you know, of course, it's an incredibly substantive talk. And of course, in support of what you're saying, I oddly enough kept thinking of what the anthropologist Frank Messick has done in a very different part of the world by looking at the actual mechanics of Ijtihad in the legal sphere, and really makes a similar case to what even Lev on Abraham Young was saying briefly, of just the palimpsest of writing on top and on top and on top and on top, and that's, but that, lots of people do that. What I like about Natalia's question is that I wondered, at first when I saw the phrase communist internationalism in your topic, in your title, I wondered about the work of Nergis Ertürk and the kind of literary communism she works at in the 20s, when it was really quite a sharp political set of gestures, and people read this as kind of a dangerous kind of soft power, and I wonder if it's fair, I know this is talking more around your material, but is it too opportunistic when we talk about Parajanov asking for permission to emigrate in 1978, or then becoming a darling of Makhmalbaf and others in the 80s? Is it simply because communist internationalism from the 20s to the 80s had actually morphed so profoundly? I mean, so you give a very serious answer to Natalia in the sense that the Soviet Union is a key kind of social space and an idea, but is it also possible that that idea was so watered down by the 1980s and so few people took it seriously in the sense of an actual successful project? Not, and I don't mean it was a failure, but in the sense that in the way they took it in the 20s as a really serious way of remaking the 20th century, that Parajanov could do this as a gateway to just try to leave the country, or Makhmalbaf could do this as a, in the name of internationalism, he could work around censors for other reasons, because it, that seems to be what both directors are doing in a certain way, but
Yeah,
I don't know if that's being
I completely agree with you. I completely agree with you. And I mean, sorry if this didn't come through in the talk, but like this is sort of what's happening here is that like all of these kind of ways of thinking about the cultural commons of this space, and of these different local and regional traditions that Soviet scholarship and Soviet public culture had built up, becomes, comes to like live its own life beyond, the sort of sloganeering, buttoned up version of internationalism that the Soviet Union was still peddling. I mean, I want to underplay its continued life, like in a real way in even the 80s in somewhere like Afghanistan. Certainly there are people who are taking it very seriously and really trying to make it real in the world. It's just that like all the cool ideology is going on among the Maoists and the Islamic socialists and just all these other parties where I mean, it's still the case that like until the post-Islamic revolution state murdered them all, the Tudeh party was the mass political force in Iran, and that was the party that was aligned with the Soviet Union. And they were waiting and waiting for instructions from Moscow about like, how to deal with the increasing takeover of the government by Khomeini, and the Soviet Union just kind of didn't take it seriously. And yeah.
Well, can I ask in a funny way, and then we'll go to the chat in a second because there might be something going on there. But good follow. But is it the case possibly that precisely because I don't want to play it down or put you on the spot to answer for people who took it seriously and ignore them, but I guess what I was wondering is its plasticity, did paradoxically its plasticity and the idea of communist internationalism achieve a greater plasticity and power towards the very end of the Soviet Union only because it became this free zone? Like that's kind of how I take some of the material in your talk.
A free zone?
Well, a free zone just in the sense where someone like Hodgkin can give this kind of blurring, this blur, this queering, to use a same-sex actor for the male. Like that's the thing that's so interesting is that these two cases across the Iranian Georgia and the Iranian Caucasus borders suggest that these people could afford to have these conversations without actually speaking directly to the political stakes in the way that they might have in the 20s, which gives them perhaps an even greater creativity.
Yeah, well, I mean, part of what's changed though is the way that the whole world has taken up, ways of thinking about the representative function of writers and minoritarian literatures that originates in the Soviet multinational system, and it like through like Congress of Cultural Freedom, basically trying to like outcompete Soviet institutions in the third world. You basically have the entirety of post-colonial literary organization, the sort of institutions of post-colonial literature on both sides of the Cold War are making claims, or like staking their claim to the authority to speak on behalf of groups in ways that totally come out of the Soviet multinational system. I mean, the great example of this is, so I mentioned the state-aligned Afghan Writers Union. There was also a Writers Union of Free Afghanistan run out of Peshawar that had its own CIA-backed journal, and basically the other side was making their claims in ways that are totally modeled on the Soviet way of doing that, and so yeah. Sorry.
Before we go to Gökçe with my apologies, I just want to make sure, do we have anyone on the screen?
Yeah.
Question in the chat.
Would you like to speak about the influence of competing conceptions and forms of internationalism, like the non-aligned movement associated with TITA? Yeah, so I mean, I briefly alluded to that in terms of Maoism and well, to a lesser degree, Trotskyism in Iran and Afghanistan. Afghanistan has a vital Maoist party throughout the 70s, 80s, and early 90s, and yeah, that's a big faction in the Iranian left as well. Now, the non-aligned movement and the long ballad of Soviet efforts to capture the non-aligned movement, through the Afro-Asian Solidarity Organization, and the Maoist attempt to create a counter-organization that would instead capture the non-aligned movement through their own Afro-Asian, it's a slightly different acronym, but it's still an Afro-Asian Writers Association. I mean, is a whole big story. Now, Titoism, I mean, I'm not sure that it really had much purchase in these further east regions. There's a whole nother conversation to be had about the ongoing legacy of the Persianate, the shadow of the Persianate in the Balkans, actually, in Yugoslavia and Albania. There are some extraordinary novels of the Ottoman, historical novels and kind of vaguely science fictional novels of the Ottoman period produced in that region. This is something that I've only thought about a little bit because I don't have the languages, but yes, I mean, Karen, you're talking about something interesting here that I just can't really speak to.
Let's move to
Yes.
Gökçe.
Thank you very much. So I actually two comments. Maybe one of them is partially a question. First of all, the Parajanov's film on Pir Osmani. You were saying it had some aspects of Azerbaijan. But it actually did not, and it really surprises artists. It surprises the Azerbaijani audience because he was born in Gah, the Azerbaijani city, and the film is it's filmed in a very abstract, very neutral setting. And in an artistic way, it's completely fine for me, but I can understand why it's upsetting the local people of Ga. And in terms of, what you said about plagiarism, I'd like to hear more about, in what context, and maybe I missed it, but, how it was framed as plagiarism in films. Hollywood does it all the time. Taking themes and plots from other countries and making them as American, Hollywood films. And it also reminded me in this context that there is this Japanese, Kurosawa film, Seven Samurai, was apparently it was adopted as Seven Wise Men or something in 1960 by an American filmmaker, and then it was from that American film, Azerbaijani filmmaker Tofik Tağızade made the I Want Seven Sons, Yedi Oğul İsterim. So it's, instead of plagiarism, I don't know, should we say maybe circulation or how, I'm just curious how plagiarism is contextualized. And as scholars, we're always into these categorizations, and I can't stop questioning them. So thank you.
Yeah, no, and I didn't really say anything about his Pir Osmani film. I sort of listed it with the others because it sort of belongs to this period of, being in South Caucasus, thinking about all of that. It's so kind of 19th, early 20th century, and it's sort of like feel. It's folkloric, but I wouldn't really say it's deeply Persianate. Actually, the biopic of Pir Osmani by another. By a Georgian filmmaker is maybe more interesting in this regard. But I can't remember that filmmaker's name off the top of my head. But now I don't like the framework of plagiarism for talking about this. It was just sort of notable because this
nonsense.
Yes, exactly. And it's been repeated a few times. I think, there is such a developed, complicated vocabulary in the Persianate, and really, also in Arabic, poetics, for talking about the different ways that you can cite or quote another poet. And it's not that nothing counts as plagiarism, but there's a wide range of things that, if a reasonably cultivated person can be expected to recognize the reference, then it could never be plagiarism. It's just sarikha. There's just all sorts of ways that you can refer to it, and of course, if you assume an audience of people who are all very cultivated and are going to get all your references, then you don't need to worry about people thinking that you're pretending that something is yours. Right?
We have another question in the chat. I can't tell.
I don't think so.
No.
And ladies and gentlemen, just a little before 6 o'clock, let's thank our speaker for his kind